Good afternoon and welcome to the Family Research Council. My name is Bethany DeMin and I am the Student Interns and Lectures Coordinator here. We are excited to welcome Warren Col Smith of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview here today. He and John Stonestreet have written an encouraging and timely book entitled Restoring All Things. And this afternoon I want to invite you to refill your hope tank as Warren will come to tell us about it. Just a couple housekeeping items. If you're joining us via live webcast, welcome. We're glad you're with us. And for those of you here and at home, please feel free to share the link to this video when it goes live on our site, either later today or sometime tomorrow. And so anyway, so much of what we see going on in our nation and in the world is disheartening. And taken together, it can make you want to give up. I've certainly had moments like that, even in the recent past. But a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of being commissioned as a centurion through the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And I count the program, now known as the Colson Fellows Program, as one of the most important chapters in my spiritual development. Through it, I learned more about my place in the story of humanity and the awesome mission that God is calling each one of us to participate with Him in restoring all things. This past weekend at the Colson Center's annual Wilberforce Weekend, a recurring theme during our sessions was outrage is not a strategy. And these words convict, but even more, they draw our eyes back to the words of Jeremiah 29. Paraphrasing, it says to seek the good of the city where God has sent you, for in its welfare we will find welfare. We are not to withdraw, but rather dig in, put down roots, and work for the good of our neighbors. And the people we will hear about today have done just that. Warren Col Smith has over 20 years of experience as a writer, editor, marketing professional, and entrepreneur. He's the Vice President of Mission Advancement for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and the former Associate Publisher of World Magazine, the nation's largest Christian news magazine. His books include A Lover's Quarrel with the Evangelical Church, Prodigal Press, and most recently, Restoring All Things, which we will be privileged to hear about today. He speaks often at churches, conferences, and other Christian and political events. And he has a bachelor's degree in journalism and a master's degree in English from the University of Georgia, both of those. He and his wife, Missy, have 4 children. Would you join me in welcoming Warren?
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's great to be here at the Family Research Council again. I've been here many times in the past, and I'm just grateful for the work that the FRC does and for the chance to participate with you in events like this and other events over the years. So again, just thank you very much for this opportunity. For those of you who are listening online or watching online, I should say, we'll be, I think, cutting back and forth to my slides. And on the first slide, we've got my email address, wsmith@colsoncenter.org. I'd be delighted to hear from any of you if you have feedback for me, questions or comments. And if you want a copy of the slides that I'm about to share with you today, I'd be pleased to share them with you as well. So wsmith@colsoncenter.org is my email address, and I'm always happy to hear from interested folks interested in the same things that I'm interested in. John Stonestreet and I wrote this book. It was published last year, and it was written in part motivated by what Bethany said, that if you look around the world, there's a lot to get discouraged about, a lot to be discouraged by. However, there's also a lot of great things going on in the world as well, that God is up to something really marvelous, and He is using His church, His people, to accomplish it. So as John and I were often finding ourselves together at conferences, this was before I came to the Colson Center, we would hear each other's presentations and realize that we were saying many of the same things, but from a slightly different perspective. John from a more philosophical and theological basis, which is his training and his underpinning. He brought the worldview component. And as a journalist, I brought a lot of storytelling to the process. So we decided to write Restoring All Things together, in which we begin each chapter with a kind of the philosophical or theological underpinnings of that chapter, and I'll talk more about the individual chapters in a minute. And then I would provide stories. Many of them were stories that I'd worked on as a journalist at World Magazine. Some of them came from the Breakpoint commentaries that the Colson Center for Christian Worldview does, and they air on about 1,200 radio stations around the country every day. So it's a very rich, robust collection of stories of God's people doing God's work in what some call a post-Christian culture. What I prefer to call a pre-Christian culture. I believe that God is up to something great and that perhaps the best is yet to come. The first chapter of Restoring All Things, or actually it's even before the first chapter, the introduction, we call God Loveth Rewords. And that is it's sort of an intentional play on words from the Puritans. The Puritans used to say, God loveth adverbs. He cares not how good, but how well. And so, in other words, it was a Puritan, in the Puritan milieu. It was sort of a call to Christians to engage in all manner of vocations. The idea that there was no such thing as a sacred or secular vocation. Whatever God called you to, do it well. And so, the phrase "God loveth adverbs" came into being. We took that and changed it a bit and said, God loveth rewords. And if you look in Scripture, there are all kinds of rewords. There's some of them on the screen right now: redeem, renew, restore, resurrect, reconcile, regenerate, or regeneration, or some version of those words you find throughout Scripture. Now, Christians, however, often engage in these active verbs, but often, too, we engage in other words or other activities represented by these words: resist, rebuke, react, and reject. Now, I don't want to say that those actions are not appropriate sometimes, because we do live in a fallen world, because we do live in a world that often is moving away from Christian and biblical principles. Sometimes it is necessary to resist or to reject or to rebuke. The Bible is explicit, in fact, in saying that we should resist evil. But what we're calling Christians to in Restoring All Things is, while we are also putting maybe a hand up of resistance to the evil in the world, we should also be putting a hand up of restoration and renewal as well. It's not an either or, it's a both and. So we decided that the way we wanted to organize Restoring All Things would be to look at all aspects of life and find out who is doing great work of restoration and renewal in those areas of life. And that brings me to the first point I'd like to share with you today, and that is that we think that it's important that Christians be known not just what we are against, but also what we are for. And that comes in part from what we sometimes, I guess you could say maybe in a little bit inside baseball among the Christian community, we have a Kuyperian worldview after Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper was a really remarkable Dutch thinker, and he was amazing because he wore so many hats. He was a journalist. He was the editor of one of the largest newspapers in his country for many, many years. He founded a university. He was the prime minister of the Netherlands, so he operated at the very highest levels of political influence as well. And Kuyper is famous for saying this, that there is not one square inch of the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not declare mine. God is sovereign over all, and we as his stewards should be concerned about all of creation and not just the narrow areas of creation that we sometimes call the sacred. For example, the ministry or the church or related moral issues. But that we think God is concerned about the arts, humanities. He made us in his image as creators, the very first words of Scripture. In the beginning, God created. And if we're made in his image, we are creative as well. And we think it's important for Christians to be engaged in all areas of life. So that's why we divided the book into chapters. And in fact, every word you see on the screen represents a chapter. In fact, I couldn't fit them all, but we've got chapters on addressing poverty, economics generally, defending life, education, criminal justice, disability, human sexuality, and so on. You can see these for yourself. But because we think that it's important for Christians to understand that we can and should, and here's more to the point, we are already active in all of these arenas, but for the most part, many Christians and the world do not know about all of this great activity that we're engaged in. So we wanted this book to be a celebration of that. And the book contains stories of well-known leaders. In fact, at one point I thought I would call this slide "Round Up the Usual Suspects" after the movie Casablanca, the great Humphrey Bogart movie. But I decided that might be a little bit too flippant and glib. So what I would say to you now is that we did, though, tell stories of some folks that are very well known probably to you. I'm with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, so we talk about prison fellowship and the work that they're doing in restorative justice and Chuck Colson's work generally. Johnny Erickson Tata, who, of course, was in a diving accident when she was 17 years old, became disabled, and many people would call that a tragedy. And of course, the brokenness of her body is a sign of the brokenness in the world. But Johnny was not going to be content with just living in that brokenness, and has turned her life into a marvelous testimony and a beautiful work for disabled people all around the world. And recently, even speaking out on behalf of life for those who are not able to speak for themselves. But we also have lesser-known leaders as well, folks that sometimes John and I call grass tops leaders. In other words, not the grassroots folks that are involved maybe at the very local level, and not the elite or the well-known folks like Chuck Colson and Johnny Erickson Tata, but folks that have local ministries, that are active in their communities, folks like Bruce Strom and Administer Justice. He's a lawyer who not only helps folks who don't have access to the legal system, access to justice, but he's also now showing other churches all across the country how they can set up similar ministries in their own churches. Academics such as Mike Adams at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, Robert George at Princeton University, Glenn Sunshine in Connecticut, and Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas. These are men, in this case, and the ones that I've mentioned are men, but many men and women who have taken courageous stands for the faith in an environment that is often not sympathetic to people who have positions of faith. And what we're doing by telling these stories is celebrating what Alexis de Tocqueville called the mediating institutions in our culture, what some folks would call civil society. It's the glue that holds our culture together. They are the laboratories of the good, the true, and the beautiful. They're laboratories of democracy. Whenever a Trail Life USA Trailmen, which is a youth organization for Christian boys, becomes a leader in his local trailman troop, Trail Life USA troop. He is learning about democracy as an 11 or a 12 or a 13-year-old. These are lessons that he will take to him when he goes to college and beyond. These mediating institutions, as Alexis de Tocqueville said, were part of the genius of the American experiment. And we wanted to celebrate that genius in this book by telling the stories that are just representative of what's going on all across the country. Stories of men, for example, like Kent Twitchell. Kent Twitchell is an artist who lives in the Los Angeles area. Sometimes he's called the grandfather of the LA mural art movement. Kent paints these massive murals. This one happens to be of Jesus. It's called The Word on the side of a wall at Biola University. But he's also done many, many other murals. They're all over Los Angeles, and he's become an institution in Los Angeles, and he's made Los Angeles known around the world as a center for mural art. Kent is also a deeply committed Christian. I've had a chance to interview him several times over the years, and just a remarkable man, and as you can tell, a remarkable artist as well. Folks like Makoto Fujimura, who World Magazine named our Daniel of the Year several years ago, someone who speaks truth to power. And in Mako's case, he is someone who takes the truth of Christ into the very secular world of art. Mako does what sometimes is called post-expressionist painting, and the excellence with which he applies his art and craft has caused him to be respected around the world, but he's also not been bashful, also about maintaining his Christian faith and being public about his Christian faith as well. So these are some of the folks that we tell the stories of, some well-known, some not so well-known, in all areas of life. We do that in our book through storytelling. And not only is storytelling a strategy for our book, but it's also the second key point that I wanted to stress to you today, and that is that we believe that Christians should recover the art of storytelling. Not only is storytelling a strategy in the book, but we want to model it to a certain extent to help folks understand why and how storytelling is so important. So be known what we are for and not just what we are against. And also, we think as Christians we need to recover the art of storytelling if we want to have a positive influence for Christ on our culture. My friend Andrew Peterson, who participated with me and with John on some events that we did last year, he's a musician and novelist himself, is fond of saying that if you want someone to hear the truth, you should tell them the truth. But if you want someone to love the truth, you should tell them a story. Stories have a way of connecting with us in ways that bullet points on a PowerPoint slide do not, even though I'm using both today. Again, not an either or, but a both and strategy. And I think that's why Damon of Athens, who was a musicologist and a philosopher more than 2,000 years ago, said this: "Give me the songs of a people, and I care not who writes the laws." And of course, in his era, the songs were the stories of his people. And for the Christian, these ideas should be neither new nor should we resist them, because Jesus himself was a storyteller. In fact, Mark 4:34 says that Jesus did not speak to them except in parables. In other words, except in stories. So the Bible is really one big story. It's the story of reality. It's the story of the world. And what our individual testimonies, our individual stories do should, if understood properly, illuminate that biblical meta-narrative. Now, postmodern storytelling, I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. Postmodern storytelling, however, is isolated. They're story for story's sake. It's all about me, and we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to just maybe graphically illustrate for you why stories are so powerful and how they operate in our lives. Many of you know that this mathematical symbol that you see on the screen is pi, right? 3.14. If you've had 9th or 10th grade mathematics, you probably learned that. Now, if you happen to go a little bit beyond 9th or 10th grade mathematics, you might have learned that pi is actually what is known as an irrational number. It's an infinite series of numbers. None of the patterns repeat. If I asked you to memorize pi to 100 or 150 decimal points, which is what I have here on the screen, most of you would probably laugh at me or roll your eyes at me as asking you to do something that was ridiculous or irrelevant to your lives. However, if I asked you what your phone number was, your 10-digit phone number, most of you could probably call that number. You've probably got 1 or 2 or 3 other phone numbers in your life that you can readily recall as well. Maybe your home number or your spouse's or boyfriend's or girlfriend's phone number. My wife knows not only her Social Security number, but my Social Security number. And because she's the one that mostly takes our kids to school and the doctor, she has to know their numbers to fill out forms. So she's memorized all 4 of my children's Social Security number as well. Many of you probably know what year you were born, what year you graduated from high school, what year you graduated from college, your birthday. Mine is July 11, so 7/11/58 would be the numerical representation of that number. All of a sudden, we begin to realize that we have not only dozens, but scores and even hundreds of numbers cataloged away in our brains. But the reason we're able to remember them is because there's a story behind every set of numbers. There's a context behind those numbers. So stories help us remember abstract ideas. They do that by providing context and meaning, and that's why storytelling, we think, is so important, and why Christians should recover the art of storytelling if we want to move the needle on many cultural conversations. Jim DeMint of the Heritage Foundation puts it this way: we're trying to sell vegetables while our competition is giving away candy. They are telling stories while we are producing white papers in PowerPoint presentations with bulleted items on them. And stories are important in part because of what my mentor, Chuck Colson, used to say, and that is that Christians do not impose, we propose. And stories have a very powerful way of proposing a view of reality that we might not otherwise accept if somebody tried to impose that view of reality on you. The power of storytelling is not that they win arguments in the moment, but that they win people over time. That's why I think we should begin to, or continue and even deepen our understanding of the use of storytelling. And I know this slide is a little busy and we won't go through it in depth, but I wanted to just give you one example of why it's so important. It's a story that we actually tell in Restoring All Things. Consider this timeline. In 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act passed both houses of Congress and was signed by a Democratic President, Bill Clinton. From 1998 to 2006, 30 states upheld traditional marriage in local votes in their areas, and I think that number ultimately went up to 35 to 37 states. However, in 1998, a television program premiered that probably you guys know. It's called Will and Grace. From 2000 to 2004, in fact, it was the #1 situation comedy on television. By 2006, when it went off the air, it had gone into syndication, and in 2012, Joe Biden praised the program for doing more to educate the American people on LGBT issues than any other single effort by gay activist groups. And of course, you know sort of the rest of the story. By 2014, we had the Obergefell decision in the Supreme Court. Also in 2014, items from Will and Grace were added to the Smithsonian Institution's LGBT collection. Again, an example of how storytelling, how use of the popular media was much more important at least in the public imagination than all kinds of lawmaking and policy papers. Not that those are not important. Again, I want to be really clear. I'm not advocating an either-or strategy, but a both-and strategy. However, Christians must engage in storytelling, I think, in a particular way, because the postmodern and post-Christian and secular movement is also engaged in storytelling, right? Sometimes that idea shows up by folks saying, well, that may be your truth, but that's not my truth. Or that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. And postmodern storytelling is isolated, all about the individual. Whereas biblical storytelling, Christian storytelling, should be storytelling that illuminates a larger story, a meta-narrative. The man you see on the screen is a French philosopher, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and he said, in fact, that simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward the meta-narrative. In other words, a lack of belief in any meta-narrative. The Christian position, rather, should be one in which our stories illuminate a meta-narrative. And I think that's why Robert Webber, a theologian at Wheaton College, he recently passed away, but he said this: the most pressing spiritual issue of our time is who gets to narrate the world. Who gets to tell the story of the world? Will it be Christians or will it be others who are trying to tell a different story of the world than the Christian story? So if we believe that, and if we want to start telling the story of the world, we need to understand the Christian meta-narrative. And unfortunately, many Christians do not fully understand the Christian meta-narrative. We're good at the first 3 chapters of the Christian meta-narrative, which is the creation, the fall, and redemption. We tell that story over and over, and we've gotten pretty good at it in a lot of ways, and we should keep telling that story. That's an important part of the story. But one of the things that we wanted to do in Restoring All Things was to recover the 4th chapter of that meta-narrative, and that is restoration. That God not only saved us from sin and from death and from hell, but He saved us for something. And that what He's saving us for is this restoration of all things, that to participate with Him as the body of Christ. We are His hands and feet, as a popular song said a few years ago, in this world to be about the Father's business. And so this idea of restoration is a chapter of the story of the gospel, the biblical meta-narrative, that we've not been as good at telling in the past as I hope perhaps we will be in the future. So we must learn, a third point that I wanted to share with you today is that we must learn to tell the complete biblical story, what some people call the 4-chapter gospel. And finally, the last point I wanted to make sure that we cover today is that because we do live in a broken world, even in spite of doing all of the good that we are doing, and it is a great slander against the church that the church is not active in caring for the poor or not active in caring for mothers who are choosing to keep their children rather than abort their children. We are doing a great deal. As Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute is fond of saying, if Christians withdrew from public life, there would be a giant sucking sound in the body politic. So Christians are doing great work, but we must continue that work. In fact, we must do more of it because, as Richard Weaver said, ideas have consequences, but ideas also have victims. And unfortunately, there are many victims of the anti-Christian ideologies in the world. Christians are people of hope, but we've got to be clear-eyed about what's happened over the last 100 years or what is happening in the world for the past centuries since the fall. Marxism, for example, an ideology that left 100 million or more dead in the 20th century. The sexual revolution that we're living in right now left 25 million dead from AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases, and possibly as many as 250 million worldwide because of abortion. 55 million just in the United States alone. Many people estimate that in China and Russia, those two countries together probably get us pretty close to that 250 million number. So this is a tragedy of epic proportions, unlike any that we've probably ever seen in history. So what should the Christian response be? Well, the Christian response should be what it has always been, that Christians must remember what those before us knew, that we run toward the misery. We run towards the sound of the guns. We run toward the plague. A famous example that we quote in Restoring All Things comes from Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity, which is another book that I strongly recommend to you. And he describes the plague of Cyprian, which is a plague that took place around 250 to 270 AD, at a time when there was tremendous persecution of Christians. But despite that persecutions, when that plague hit the Western world, and even though Christians were often blamed for the plague, the Christian religion, because it was a superstitious culture, would be blamed for that plague. Christians did not accept either the blame or they were not intimidated into inaction. They ran towards the plague, while many of the elite who could afford to would send their families into the country, into the countryside, because it was where the cities, it was in the cities where the plague was most acute. Christians would stay, and they would care for the sick, often at the cost of their own lives. The Christian church was decimated during that period, in part because leaders were killed. Leaders of the Christian church died in the plagues alongside everyone else. But Rodney Stark says that a remarkable thing happened, that within a generation of the plague of Cyprian, in large part because of the witness of the men and women who stayed to care for the sick of that plague, that Christianity experienced a resurgence, a revival, I was going to say a rebirth, but because it was still catching fire, I would say flowering might be a better word. And so within a generation or two, Christianity, which had been a marginal religion before the plague of Cyprian, became the dominant religion of the Western world and of the Roman Empire. And it was a key event in the early development of Christianity. So in Restoring All Things, John Stonestreet and I asked this question: are we running toward the plagues of our day? And we asked that by asking these 4 questions, and I'm getting sort of near the end, and I'll my penultimate charge to you would be to consider these 4 questions. What is good in our culture that we can promote, protect, and celebrate? What is missing that we can creatively contribute? What is evil in our culture that we can stop? Again, the rewords sometimes do include resisting. And we need to be about that work as well. It should just not be an either or, but a both and work. And what is broken in our culture that we can restore? I think that if we as individuals who are called by God each to our individual and specific vocations can ask these questions about our lives, I think that not only will we live lives that are much more fulfilling, much more on mission and on purpose for what God has called us to do, but I think it will also be a powerful testimony to the world. And it's with that idea in mind that I want to close with a story that, once again, we tell in Restoring All Things. It's a story that we learned from Jim Liskey, who for many years was the president of Prison Fellowship. And he talks about the village of Ephesus in the first century in this story. It's a town that was ruled, at least from a religious point of view, by the priest of the temple of Artemis. At the temple of Artemis, there was a perpetual flame that was tended by the priest there. And, of course, in that first century era, the flame was sort of like your doctor and electric utility and water and sanitation all in one. It was the way you cooked food. It was the way you sanitized water. It was the way you cared for the sick by boiling things and caring for your family. It provided heat for your home in the evening and in the winter. So if your flame went out, you were in big trouble. And so if it did go out, you would take a ceramic bowl, to the temple of Artemis, and you would pay a tribute to the priest, and they would fill your ceramic bowl with hot coals, and you could bring those hot coals back to your home and reinvigorate your fire. And now the priest taught that if you got your fire in any other way, that the gods would be offended, and that it would not be good for you or for the city. And, of course, the priest perpetuated that myth because that's how they got paid. When people would come with their financial tributes to get their fire bowls renewed if their fires happened to go out. However, something amazing started happening in the first century after Christians began to be converted. And whenever they noticed that there was a home where there was no smoke coming out of the roof, they would bring fire to their neighbors. And this was a powerful statement to their neighbors. Not only did it meet a physical need, a real and acute physical need, but it also said, we are not afraid of the pagan gods, that our God is stronger than the gods of the temple of Artemis. And over time, the Christians in that early first century era, by doing this simple act of compassion and benevolence to their neighbors, while also, without even opening their words in many cases, making a powerful theological statement, were able to revolutionize the Near Eastern world and cause Christianity to grow and flower there. I tell that story to ask in closing this question: what does it mean to be a fire bearer in our own time? What is it that we can do? What is it that you and I can do in our own lives in the context of the vocation that God has given us, in other words, our calling, and in the culture in which we have been placed? What can we do to be a fire bearer in our day? I think if we can answer that question, we will go a long way towards accomplishing what the title of our book says: be engaged with God in the process of restoring all things. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it very much. We do have a little bit of time for questions, so I think we'll have a mic for those of you that are not here in the room, those of you that are watching online. We're going to pass a microphone around so you can hear the questions. Yes, please.
Warren, Rob Schwarzwalder with FRC. Thank you so much. This is an incredibly encouraging lecture. One of the things that strikes me, and I think many of us, is the believing church is doing a lot of good stuff behind the scenes. And, you look at the Christian charities there are myriad charities here at home and abroad. Our churches are doing many, many good things. There are millions of Catholic hospitals, or millions of hospital beds in Catholic hospitals that are provided, and so forth, on. And yet, our ability to penetrate popular culture and its stereotype of us as being rigid and ingrown and uncompassionate, it's very difficult to to shake that.
Yep.
Do you have some practical suggestions as to how we can do that?
Well, first of all, it's a really great question, and I would also say that it took us 100 years to get here. It might take us 100 years if the Lord tarries to get out of the situation that we're in. It's one of the reasons why one of my great passions in life, especially as a journalist, is to write about and to study media bias. I think one of the reasons that we are in the position that we're in right now is not because Christians are not actively engaged, as you said. They are. We are. We tell those stories in our book, and you rightly described a few more situations. But we have a media that is overwhelmingly either blind to or indifferent to that work, and it makes it easy to caricature Christians as being not compassionate and not engaged in that work. Marvin Olasky wrote a book called Prodigal Press in 1988. I had the privilege of revising that book with him in 2013 on the 25th anniversary of it, and we cited literally scores of examples of where the media will ignore the work of the church in favor of, say, for example, the work of the government. One real quick example, Superstorm Sandy, whenever it hit the tri-state area a few years ago, it shut down New York, shut down the New York Stock Exchange, and whenever the New York Stock Exchange went back in session a couple of days later, they had the head of FEMA, they had the mayor of New York, they had the governor of New York, the mayor of New York and the governor of New York, all on the platform ringing the bell to say New York is open for business again. They completely ignored the work of the church, who were the first responders of Superstorm Sandy. World Magazine did a great package of stories on, even before FEMA was able to get to some of the places that were affected by Superstorm Sandy. Neighbors were helping neighbors, Christians motivated by their faith, churches were mobilizing there. And the media ignores that. I don't believe that there's an active conspiracy. I just believe that over time, because liberals and secularists control academia, they have then, their graduates have then gone into the media, and they control the media, which is one of the reasons why we have some stories in Restoring All Things about journalists and writers and folks that are, involved in the arts and entertainment, because we think that it's really important for Christians to be actively engaged in these vocations as well. But it's not going to be a short-term project. John Stonestreet, my a co-writer in this book, is fond of saying that in the 1960s, liberals went after the English departments and conservatives went after the White House. By 1980, we had both achieved our goals. That, we had a conservative in the White House, and they owned every English department, every, journalism school all across America. Now fast forward another 30 years and you see where we are. It's one of the reasons why Chuck Colson used to say that politics is downstream from culture. So we've got to be more engaged in these culture-making activities if we're going to solve the problem that you're rightly describing. But Rob, it's going to take years, decades probably. Yeah. Any more questions?
All right. Along those lines, could you also speak to the place of recognition in this restorative process? I mean, how much, if, for example, Christians are pushed out to where they're not recognized, how does that affect their God's restorative plan that you're talking about?
Well, I think it's going to have a big effect on it, which is why I actively affirm the work of the FRC and the Heritage Foundation and Alliance Defending Freedom and many other the Beckett Fund for Religious. I mean, I better stop, or I'll leave out a lot of folks, so won't leave out one or two. There are a lot of folks that are actively engaged in the fight for religious liberty. I think it's one of the key fights of our day. And if Christians are marginalized, if merely proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ gets declared as hate speech in this culture, that is going to be a very, very serious problem for the church, but also for the culture, because again, it has been the active participation of godly Christian people in our culture that has made such a positive difference. We look at such phrases in our founding documents as being endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. These are deeply biblical ideas, and I think that we've got to be engaged in defending these ideas. And I've from the work of the FRC, for example, in that work. Am I getting at your question? Is that what you were? Okay, great, good. Yes, ma'am. The microphone is making its way.
Thanks for your presentation.
Sure.
My question is, how do you foresee that Christians will focus more on increasing culture and the different ways that we can support the arts? Because I believe that Christians need to really put their money also in the arts, because we need to influence music and media and movies, but also how to make those things relevant and of excellent quality, that the larger culture will want to engage in the production of these arts.
Well, I think it's a good question, and again, it's not. I think, as in the question that Rob asked earlier, these are long-term enterprises, right? These are. I think we need to gird our loins for a long. I don't know if you want to call it fight. It's certainly a long journey, and we need to celebrate the good, the true, and the beautiful where we find it. And then hope that by celebrating the good, the true, and the beautiful where we find it in the work of Kent Twitchell and Mako Fujimori and the movies and not just the movies of Christian filmmakers such as, for example, the Irwin brothers who did October Sky and some of the other October Baby, not October Sky, but October Baby. But also, other filmmakers like Terrence Malick, a secular filmmaker who's actively engaged in wrestling with spiritual matters. I think we should celebrate them. We should encourage our young people to go into those fields. We should encourage those who are more mature in that process, for example, like Mako, who is to mentor others. I use Mako as an example because I know he's already doing that. He formed the International Arts Movement, which is a community of Christians who are engaged in the arts, and recently he went to the Bream Center, which is part of Fuller Seminary, which is engaged specifically in this idea of trying to raise up culture makers that are also deeply informed by a Christian worldview. So we need to celebrate them where we can. One of the things that we need to do is we need to the extent that we've lost, we also need to recover the Reformation idea of vocation. And it's not just a Reformation idea, it's a Christian idea that was lost for a season but recovered by the Reformers of vocation, that there's no divide between the sacred and the secular, that if you are about this work that is restorative and you're doing it for God's glory, whether you're a carpenter or whether you're a preacher, it's all the same in God's eyes. What matters is that we are to be obedient to our calling, whatever that calling is, and not judge ourselves by other people's callings or the fruitfulness of their particular vocation. As Chuck was fond of saying, stay at your post and do all that you do to the glory of God. And I think if we would do that, if we would recover that idea, we would see more and better work by Christians in the arts, in movies, and entertainment. And I just also want to say, too, that all is not lost. There's some really good work going on these days. I would say that within the last 10 years, we've seen more great Christian filmmaking than we've seen a lot of really bad Christian filmmaking. Let's be real clear about that. But, making a film is not easy. It requires both artistic vision and technical skills. I mean, there's an old saying in Hollywood that nobody sets out to make a bad movie, but a lot of bad movies get made. And part of the reason is because it's really hard. And we should encourage failure in a way, because failure is how we learn. Even among our Christian brothers and sisters, we should support them and celebrate them whenever they actually, against all odds, do it well.
In recent months to maybe the last 2 years, there's been a lot of talk about Rod Dreher's idea of the Benedict option. When I first read about it, I actually identified
greatly with what he was getting at, and we've discussed it quite a bit here, that it's kind of dying the death of 1,000 qualifications at this point, because he's starting to say, well, I didn't really mean that, and I understand where he's coming up against some legitimate concerns about that. My question is, how do we preserve truly Christian culture, biblical culture, and obviously, as you just said, there's no difference between secular and sacred, because if we subscribe to the Kuyperian understanding of the world, it is all Christ's. But there are things that legitimately should be preserved, and those things that we are for need to be preserved and protected. How do we balance that? Because we don't have a lot of time, and all of us are, subject to the tyranny of the urgent. How do we, do both, engage and preserve?
Yeah, that's a really great question and a really hard question, and I'm not going to answer it definitively today, except to say that, the Bible says that we are to be a people set apart. We're to be a peculiar people. We're to be sanctified. We're going to be set apart. And the Bible also says to be in the world and not of it. Well, how can those both be true? And so I think a part of the answer of how they both are true is that we as Christians have to have a little bit more comfort with notions of paradox and mystery than we have been comfortable with in the past. We have tended to want to be, black and white. This is right and this is wrong. And sometimes there absolutely are things that are right and certain things that are wrong. But there is a great deal in the world that I think that does sort of fall into this area of paradox. I should say, in a spirit of full disclosure, that Rod Dreher is a friend, and I've interviewed him several times about the Benedict option. I do not believe that he's calling for a true separatism from culture, and he's even, like you said, it's the Benedict option dying the death of 1,000 qualifications, at least half of that 1,000 coming from Rod himself, right? So there's then people like Marvin Olasky at World have promoted the Daniel option, which is, living in Babylon, speaking truth to power. What does that look like when we're an exiled people? The Acton Institute talks about Christians being a people in exile, for example, and all of that. So I think these ideas are interesting, and there's wisdom in many of them, and we should continue to have that conversation and have that dialogue amongst ourselves. I think that if the Bible had meant for us to have a single clear understanding, there would be in First Assumptions, chapter 3, verse 2, it would have said, "Thou shalt follow the Benedict option, or the Daniel option, or the Kuyperian option, or whatever it is." The fact that it is not there tells me that it is that I think God wants us to wrestle with these ideas in the cultural moment in which we find ourselves with the gifts that He has given us. And so that would be, I think, as close to a definitive answer as I would come, is to be thoroughly biblical in your understanding and be humble in whatever option you are holding on to at any given moment, whether it's Daniel or Kuyper or Benedict, because it's true only to the extent that it is biblical. And none of these man-made options are probably going to be ever thoroughly, completely biblical. Any more questions? Well, listen, thank you so much for having me. Those of you listening online, watching online, I'm so grateful to you for your participation as well. I hope that what I was able to share with you today was meaningful to you. My email address again is wsmith@colsoncenter.org. I'd be happy to share with you any of the slides that I have shared today. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.